The hallway is quiet in a way that feels intentional, as if sound itself has chosen not to travel there. The lights are low and warm, casting long, soft shadows that stretch across the carpet and up the walls. A guest walks slowly, not frightened, not even uneasy, just aware that the space feels different from the rest of the hotel. They stop in front of a mirror, the kind you pass without thinking during the day. At night, though, it holds your attention longer than it should. The reflection is clear, steady, perfectly ordinary, and for a moment, that is all there is. Then something shifts. It is not movement exactly, not at first. It is the sense that the reflection contains more than it did a second ago, that the space behind them in the glass is somehow deeper than the hallway itself. The guest leans slightly, adjusting their angle, trying to understand what feels off, and that is when they see her. A woman stands just behind them in the reflection. She is not vague or distorted. She is precise, composed, her features soft but unmistakable, her expression calm in a way that feels deliberate. She is looking directly at the guest, not at the mirror, not past them, but at them, as though the glass is not a barrier but a meeting point. The guest turns immediately. There is no one in the hallway. The space behind them is empty, the shadows unchanged, the silence intact. No footsteps, no movement, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. The hotel feels exactly as it did before, as though it has quietly corrected itself. They turn back to the mirror. Now it shows only their own reflection again, perfectly aligned, perfectly normal, offering no hint that anything unusual has occurred. If there was something else there, it has chosen not to remain. The guest stands there for a moment longer, trying to decide which version of reality to accept. Then, slowly, they walk away, leaving the mirror behind them, still and waiting, as if it knows it will not have to wait long for the next person to look. This is strAInge, and today we're beginning our look at paranormal LA with the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. The Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel opened in 1927, at a moment when Hollywood was still inventing itself, when the idea of a film industry had not yet hardened into the global force it would become. Los Angeles was expanding, studios were consolidating power, and a new kind of celebrity was beginning to emerge, one built not on stage presence or social standing, but on projection, repetition, and the strange permanence of film. The Roosevelt was designed to meet that moment, not as a temporary lodging, but as a declaration that Hollywood intended to endure, to root itself in architecture as much as in imagination. From the beginning, the hotel was less a place to stay, and more a place to be seen, a social and cultural anchor for an industry still unsure of its own boundaries. Its Spanish colonial revival design gave it a sense of history it did not yet possess, with tiled floors, carved archways, and grand interior spaces that suggested permanence in a city often accused of having none. Actors, directors, producers, and hopefuls moved through its corridors not just as guests, but as participants in something larger, a shared project of identity creation that blurred the line between public and private selves. That sense of importance crystallized in 1929, when the first Academy Awards ceremony was held in the hotel's Blossom Ballroom. It was not the spectacle it would later become, but a private dinner, modest in scale, attended by fewer than 300 people who could not have known they were establishing one of the defining rituals of modern entertainment. Yet even in its simplicity, the event carried weight, gathering individuals at the peak of ambition, recognition, and anxiety, each aware, in some quiet way, that they were part of something new and potentially lasting. Over the decades that followed, the Roosevelt continued to draw people at transitional moments in their lives. Arrivals, departures, breakthroughs, collapses, and reinventions, all unfolding within the same walls. For some, it marked the beginning of a career. For others, a fleeting peak. And for still others, a place to disappear from public view, while maintaining the illusion of presence. The hotel became a crossroads where personal narratives overlapped, sometimes briefly, sometimes intensely, each leaving behind traces that were not always visible, but were rarely insignificant. If there is a common thread in the stories attached to the Roosevelt, it is not a single tragedy or a defining incident, but accumulation, the layering of human experience over nearly a century. Unlike places associated with one catastrophic event, the hotel's history is diffuse, composed of thousands of smaller moments, each carrying its own emotional weight. The question that emerges from this is not whether something happened there, but whether enough happened. Whether repetition and intensity can leave an imprint as strong as any singular event. In a city built on performance, where identity is crafted, projected, and consumed, the Roosevelt occupies a unique position as both stage and archive. People came there to become something, to be recognized, to fix themselves in the perception of others, and in doing so, they may have left behind more than memory. Whether understood as psychology, environment, or something less easily explained, the hotel has developed a reputation not because of one story, but because of many, each reinforcing the idea that the past within those walls is not entirely settled. Today, the Roosevelt continues to function as it always has, welcoming guests who may be drawn by its history, its location, or simply the promise of proximity to Hollywood's mythology. Most experience nothing unusual, moving through the same spaces that have hosted nearly a century of lives without incident. Yet for some, there is a moment, subtle and easily dismissed, when the hotel feels less like a place that contains history, and more like a place that continues to hold it, as though the boundary between what has happened and what is happening is thinner than it should be. Marilyn Monroe arrived at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel before she became the version of herself the world would come to recognize, at a time when she was still navigating the uncertain boundary between anonymity and visibility. She lived in the hotel during her early modeling years, occupying a space that placed her physically close to the center of the industry she was trying to enter, but not yet fully part of. It was a transitional period, defined by constant evaluation, by the need to be seen and remembered, and by the pressure to transform an ordinary presence into something that could hold attention. Within that space stood a full-length mirror, an object that would have been entirely unremarkable to anyone else, but carried a different weight for someone whose future depended so heavily on appearance and perception. For Monroe, the mirror was not simply reflective, but instrumental, a tool for rehearsal, adjustment, and self-construction, allowing her to study not just how she looked, but how she might be seen. In a profession where identity could be shaped and reshaped through small visual choices, such an object became part of a daily process, one that blurred the distinction between the person and the persona she was building. After her death in 1962, the mirror was reportedly removed from the room and placed into storage, a routine decision that did not initially carry any significance. It was only after staff began to interact with it in that context that the first unusual accounts emerged, described quietly and without formal documentation. Individuals passing by the stored mirror claimed to notice figures that were not physically present, brief impressions that could be dismissed in isolation, but became more difficult to ignore as they were repeated by different people over time. When the mirror was eventually returned to a more visible location within the hotel, the nature of the reports shifted from private staff accounts to guest experiences, widening the scope of the phenomenon. Visitors described seeing a second figure in the reflection, often positioned just behind them, appearing clearly enough to be recognized, yet vanishing when they turned to confirm what they had seen. The descriptions shared common elements: a blonde woman, a composed expression, and a presence that seemed aware rather than incidental, as though it occupied the reflective space deliberately rather than accidentally. What distinguishes these accounts is not their dramatic intensity, but their consistency across decades, involving individuals with no connection to one another and no apparent reason to produce identical descriptions. The experiences are often brief, lasting only a moment, with witnesses questioning their own perception even as they recount the details. This combination of clarity and doubt has allowed the story to persist without resolution, existing in a space between explanation and belief. There is also a symbolic dimension that makes the mirror an especially compelling focal point for such reports. Monroe's public identity was deeply tied to visibility, to the act of being looked at and remembered, and to the transformation of personal presence into cultural image. A mirror, as both object and concept, aligns closely with that dynamic, functioning as a surface where identity is both confirmed and constructed. If any aspect of a person's experience were to leave a lasting impression in a physical space, it is not unreasonable to imagine that it might attach itself to an object so closely tied to how that person existed in the world. Attempts to explain the phenomenon have ranged from psychological suggestion to environmental factors such as lighting, reflection angles, and the influence of expectation in a historically significant setting. These interpretations offer plausible frameworks, particularly given the power of suggestion, in a location already associated with a well-known figure. At the same time, they do not fully account for the uniformity of the reports, or the specific details that recur in descriptions separated by years or even decades. The mirror remains in the hotel, accessible to those who pass through its corridors, continuing to function as both a historical artifact and a point of quiet speculation. Most who encounter it see nothing unusual, experiencing it as exactly what it is, a reflective surface in a historic building. Yet for those who report something more, the experience tends to follow a similar pattern, a moment of recognition, a brief sense of shared space, and then an absence that restores the ordinary, while leaving behind a question that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The accounts that extend beyond individual rooms at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel are less cohesive, but in some ways more compelling, because they resist being tied to a single person or moment. Instead of one identifiable presence, there are multiple reports scattered across different areas of the building, each carrying its own tone and detail. Taken separately, they are easy to dismiss, but taken together, they form a pattern that suggests the hotel is not defined by one lingering story, but by many overlapping ones. In the Blossom Ballroom, where the first Academy Awards were held, staff and visitors have described encounters with a figure dressed in formal evening wear, usually seen at the periphery of the space. The figure is most often noticed in reflections or in moments when the room is otherwise empty, standing or moving with a composure that feels deliberate rather than accidental. Witnesses tend to describe a brief awareness, a sense that the figure is not simply present but attentive, followed by a disappearance that leaves no trace of how it occurred. Unlike more static reports, these sightings carry a subtle implication of interaction, not in the sense of communication, but in awareness, as though the presence recognizes that it has been observed. This detail, while difficult to verify, appears frequently enough to distinguish the ballroom accounts from those that feel purely residual. The setting itself adds to the effect, as the room has hosted decades of formal gatherings, performances, and ceremonies, each contributing to an atmosphere that already carries a sense of staged presence. Elsewhere in the hotel, the Tropicana pool presents a different type of report, one that is less formal and more disjointed. Late at night, when the area is closed and largely unoccupied, security personnel have described seeing a small figure moving along the edge of the water, often interpreted as a child. The figure is typically observed in motion, running or shifting position quickly, and disappears when approached or directly focused upon. These encounters are brief and inconsistent, but they recur often enough to be shared among staff as part of the hotel's informal history. Accompanying these sightings are reports of physical traces that appear without clear cause, particularly wet footprints on dry surfaces near the pool. These impressions are usually described as partial or incomplete, appearing for a short time before fading or being disturbed. While such details can be attributed to environmental factors, their association with the sightings has reinforced the sense that the area holds a distinct kind of presence, separate from the more historically anchored accounts within the building. There are also smaller, less easily categorized experiences reported throughout the hotel, many of which involve sound rather than sight. Guests have described hearing doors close in empty hallways, voices that do not resolve into words, or movement in adjacent rooms that are later confirmed to be unoccupied. Telephones ringing without a source, lights behaving inconsistently, and objects being found in slightly altered positions are all part of this broader category. Incidents that are individually mundane, but collectively suggest a pattern. What connects these varied reports is not their similarity, but their distribution, appearing across different floors, different eras, and different types of space within the hotel. There is no single narrative that explains all of them, no central figure that accounts for every experience. Instead, the Roosevelt presents a fragmented picture, one in which multiple presences, or multiple interpretations of presence, coexist without aligning into a unified explanation. This fragmentation may be the defining characteristic of the hotel's reputation, setting it apart from locations associated with a single, clearly defined haunting. Rather than telling one story repeatedly, the Roosevelt appears to hold many stories at once, each emerging under different conditions and to different observers. The result is not a clear narrative, but an accumulation of moments that resist easy categorization. For those who encounter something unusual within the hotel, the experience is often brief and ambiguous, leaving room for doubt even as it lingers in memory. There is rarely a moment of certainty, only a suggestion that something was present but cannot be fully accounted for. That ambiguity, more than any single sighting, is what allows the stories to persist, carried forward not as proof, but as possibility. What ultimately distinguishes the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel is not the clarity of its stories, but their persistence in the absence of a single, defining explanation. Unlike locations anchored to one widely accepted event, the Roosevelt resists simplification, offering instead a collection of experiences that overlap without fully aligning. The result is a kind of narrative density, where the accumulation of moments carries more weight than any individual account. In considering these reports, it becomes necessary to move beyond the question of whether any one experience is true and instead examine why the same types of experiences continue to emerge. The hotel has functioned for nearly a century as a space where identity is constructed, performed, and in many cases strained under pressure. People arrive there to become something, to test themselves against expectation, and to negotiate the distance between who they were and who they needed to appear to be. That process, repeated across decades, creates an environment shaped not just by events, but by emotional intensity. Hollywood itself plays a role in how these experiences are interpreted, as it is a place built on illusion, projection, and the manipulation of perception. Guests entering the Roosevelt are already aware, at least in part, of its history, and that awareness can influence how ambiguous moments are understood. A reflection that lingers, a sound that lacks an immediate source, or a fleeting sense of presence can be framed within an existing narrative, reinforcing it, even when no definitive conclusion can be drawn. At the same time, the consistency of certain details across independent accounts complicates a purely psychological explanation. Similar descriptions of figures, movements, and sensations have been reported by individuals with no connection to one another, often separated by years or decades. While this does not confirm the presence of anything beyond ordinary experience, it does suggest that the environment itself may contribute to these perceptions in ways that are not fully understood. The Roosevelt continues to operate as a modern hotel, hosting events, accommodating guests, and functioning within the everyday rhythms of Los Angeles. Most who pass through it experience nothing unusual, encountering only its architecture, its history, and its place within the broader landscape of Hollywood. Yet the stories persist, carried by those who have experienced something they cannot easily explain, and reinforced by the building's long association with figures whose identities were defined by visibility and performance. In that sense, the hotel may be understood less as a haunted location in the traditional sense, and more as a space where the past remains active in subtle ways. It does not present a single, coherent narrative, nor does it offer clear evidence of anything beyond perception. Instead, it creates conditions in which certain experiences become possible, moments where the boundary between memory and presence feels less stable than expected. For those who encounter these moments, the effect is rarely dramatic, but often lasting, a brief disruption that resists immediate dismissal. It is not the certainty of what was seen or felt that lingers, but the uncertainty, the sense that something occurred just outside the limits of clear understanding. That uncertainty is what sustains the Roosevelt's reputation, allowing it to remain, not as a solved mystery, but as an open question. And that question does not end here, because just a few miles away, high above the city, another landmark carries its own history of sightings, tragedies, and lingering presence, a place where the boundary between symbol and reality becomes even more unstable. Next time, we go to the site of suicides and the symbol of broken dreams. We're looking at the Hollywood sign. This is strAInge.